The amber glow of the bar lights caught the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, frantic soul in the limbo between the polished mahogany and the vaulted ceiling. In The Velvet Glove, silence was a currency as valued as the aged whiskey in its crystal decanters. Tonight, that silence was heavy, purchased and enforced by the presence of one man. Luca Moretti did not need to speak to command a room. His stillness was a language everyone understood, a dialect of pure, unadulterated power. He sat in the central booth, a king on a throne of dark leather, his fingers steepled, his eyes, the color of a winter storm, missing nothing. Behind the bar, Chloe moved with an economy of motion that was both graceful and utterly self-contained. The other staff, Marco and the new girl, Anya, moved like startled deer, their nervous glances flickering towards the VIP section. But Chloe's hands were steady as she polished a glass, her focus absolute. She was the still point in the turning world of the lounge, a calm, deep well in a desert of tension. She knew who he was, of course. The Wolf. The name was a whisper that clung to the city's underbelly. But for Chloe, the man was more than a name or a reputation. He was a ghost, a half-remembered fragment from the shattered mosaic of her childhood. The memory was always the same, the cold bite of rain on her cheeks, the sharp, terrifying crack of gunfire that wasn't fireworks, the heavy thud of her father's body hitting the wet asphalt. And then, a different shadow. Not one of violence, but of salvation. A teenage boy, all sharp angles and furious eyes, lunging from the alley's darkness. He hadn't spoken. He'd just wrapped his arms around her, a human shield, pressing her small frame behind the cold, greasy bulk of a dumpster. She'd felt the frantic beat of his heart against her back, smelled the rain and iron on his jacket. He'd held her there until the sirens wailed, and then he was gone, vanishing back into the gloom as if he were a part of it. All she had left was the phantom feeling of that protection and a small, jagged scar on her palm from where she'd fallen. Now, that ghost was flesh and blood, 20 feet away. And he was in danger. Her eyes, sharpened by a lifetime of observation, caught the furtive movement. A man, new to Luca's inner circle, a weasel-faced man named Silas, lingered a moment too long near the bar's premium stock. She saw his hand, quick as a snake, hover over the bottle of Angel Share bourbon, the one reserved exclusively for the dawn. A tiny vial, clear and sinister, was emptied into the glass before the drink was poured. The act was so smooth, so practiced, it was almost invisible. Almost. A cold certainty settled in Chloe's gut. This was the same method, the same type of odorless, fast-acting toxin her father's file had mentioned all those years ago. History was not just repeating itself, it was taunting her. She didn't hesitate. Fear was a luxury her life had not afforded her. On a small coaster, her hand perfectly steady, she wrote the 5 words that would detonate her quiet existence. Asterisk, don't drink it. Smile and leave now. Asterisk, she approached the booth, the air thickening with every step. The bodyguard's eyes were on her, but her gaze was locked on Luca. As she set the glass and the coaster down, she allowed her fingers to linger for a half-second, ensuring the paper slid silently beneath. His stormy eyes dropped to the note, then snapped back to hers. In that infinite, suspended moment, she saw not the feared Mafia boss, but the defiant, terrified boy from the alley. There was no fear in her own eyes, only a fierce, urgent plea, an echo from a rain-soaked night 2 decades past. His reaction was not what anyone expected. There was no start of surprise, no panicked glance. Instead, a cold, terrifying calm settled over his features. But his eyes were alight with a furious, calculating fire. As he slowly, deliberately, pushed the glass away, his other hand moved with blinding speed. His fingers, strong as steel bands, closed around her wrist. The grip was not painful, but it was absolute, an inescapable anchor. It was the touch of a man who took what he wanted and held on to what was his. The contact sent a jolt through her, a live wire of memory and present danger. He leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was for her alone, the sound seeming to vibrate through the very bones of her arm. "You have my attention," he said, the words not a question, but a command. "Now, you will have my curiosity." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the massive bodyguard at his shoulder. The world in the velvet glove remained frozen, but Chloe's life was now being pulled by an irresistible, dangerous tide, back towards the shadow that had once saved her. The world did not so much shatter as it simply receded, its sounds and colors bleeding away until all that remained was the iron-strong circle of his fingers around her wrist and the stormy, impenetrable gray of his eyes. Time, which had moments before flowed with a lazy current of a late evening, now froze into a single, crystalline point of peril. Chloe could feel the collective breath of the room being held, a silent, suffocating pressure. The clinking of glasses had ceased. The low hum of the ventilation system faded into nothingness. Even the frantic, panic beating of her own heart seemed to stall in her chest, cowed into submission by the sheer, overwhelming force of his presence. He did not rise quickly. Every movement was a study in controlled, deliberate power, a panther uncoiling from a state of repose. His grip on her wrist shifted, not loosening, but adjusting, his thumb pressing against the delicate bones in a way that was not cruel, but was undeniably possessive. It was a signal, a silent command that she was now an extension of his will, tethered to him by this point of contact. He used that connection to guide her, not roughly, but with an inexorable pull that brooked no resistance. Her feet moved almost of their own volition, her body understanding the new, terrifying physics of this situation before her mind could catch up. To stumble, to resist, to make a scene was to invite a swift and final conclusion. They moved through the lounge, a silent, processional of two. The sea of tables and chairs parted before them, not with any visible movement, but through the sheer force of the tension they radiated. Marco, her fellow bartender, had gone pale, a clean glass frozen in his white-knuckled hand. Anya had simply vanished, likely hiding in the stockroom. Luca's men were a study in seamless, lethal efficiency. As their dawn moved, so did they, a protective phalanx forming around them without a single word being uttered. One opened the heavy, soundproof door to the back office. Another took up a post outside, his broad back a final, impenetrable barrier to the world they were leaving behind. The door clicked shut, and the silence in the office was of a different quality altogether. It was thick, velvety, absorbing all sound. The room was opulent in a masculine, understated way, dark wood, shelves of untouched first editions, a single, stark abstract painting on the wall. It was a sanctuary and a prison cell all at once. Only then did Luca release her wrist. The sudden absence of his touch felt like a loss of anchor, leaving her adrift. A faint, warm thrumming lingered on her skin, a ghost of his grip. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, he walked to the large, empty desk, leaning against its edge, his posture deceptively relaxed as he finally leveled his gaze upon her. He simply looked, his eyes performing a slow, comprehensive inventory. He was not seeing a bartender, not a woman, but a variable. An anomaly in his meticulously controlled equation. He took in the calm set of her shoulders, the way her hands, now free, did not ring together but hung loosely at her sides, the direct and unflinching manner in which she met his stare. This was all data being processed behind that storm-gray gaze. "Start," he said, the single word cutting through the silence like a shard of ice. It was not a shout, but it carried the weight of a gavel's fall. "The man on my left. Silas. You identified him with a glance. You knew the method. You knew the specific bottle. That is 3 pieces of intelligence no one behind a bar should possess." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air between them, a tangible thing. "You have 5 seconds to provide a context for this information that does not end with you disappearing into the foundation of a new construction project." His voice was calm, lethally so. It was the voice of a man for whom violence was not an emotional outburst, but a logical conclusion, a tool of his trade. Chloe drew a slow breath, the air cool in her lungs. The initial, heart-pounding fear was gone, replaced by a strange, crystalline clarity. She was in the wolf's den, and survival now depended not on flight, but on a dangerous, precise truth. "He made a call 20 minutes ago," she began, her own voice steady, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "He stood by the end of the bar, pretending to be on a personal call. His voice was low, but I heard him say, 'The package is in the top-shelf bourbon.' I didn't think much of it until I saw him pour your drink." He palmed a small, clear vial. The way he moved, it was practiced. "It's an alkaloid-based toxin, odorless, slightly sweet. It causes cardiac arrest within minutes, and it mimics a natural heart attack almost perfectly." She delivered the facts cleanly, without embellishment, her eyes never leaving his. "It's the same method used in the assassination of a man named Robert Hayes. 20 years ago. On Mulberry Street. The name, Robert Hayes, landed in the quiet room not with a shout, but with the soft, devastating finality of a tombstone ceiling. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold calculation passed through Luca Moretti's eyes. It was too fast to identify, shock, recognition, a sliver of ancient pain, but it was there, a crack in the granite facade. He knew the name. He knew the street. He knew the night. His head tilted almost imperceptibly, and the air in the room shifted once more. The immediate, lethal threat receded, replaced by a deeper, more profound and unsettling mystery. The interrogation was no longer about a poison plot. It had just become about a ghost. The name, Robert Hayes, did not simply hang in the air, it seeped into the very fabric of the soundproof room, altering its chemistry, its pressure, its very purpose. The opulent office was no longer just a place of business or interrogation. It had become a seance, and Chloe had just summoned a ghost that Luca Moretti had spent a lifetime believing was buried too deep for anyone else to ever unearth. The flicker in his storm-gray eyes was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the landscape of his face had changed. The cold, predatory calculation was still there, but it was now layered with something far more dangerous, a profound, personal, and utterly bewildered curiosity. He did not speak for a long moment, a silence that was heavier and more potent than any threat could ever be. His gaze remained locked on her, but it was no longer just an inspection. It was an excavation. He was no longer looking for the lie in her story, he was searching for the key to a lock he had thrown away 2 decades ago. The mention of Mulberry Street was one thing, it was a location, a fact that could, theoretically, be researched. But the name Robert Hayes, that was a different kind of secret. That was a piece of the foundation upon which the men known as the Wolf had been built, a cornerstone laid in blood and rain on a forgotten street. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself off the edge of the desk. He did not approach her. Instead, he moved to a small, discreet intercom panel on the wall. His voice, when he spoke into it, was the same low, controlled tone, but the command was different. "Sal. My office. Now. And bring the initial dossier on our guest." He released the button and turned back to her, his hands slipping into the pockets of his tailored trousers. The casualness of the gesture was a lie, every line of his body was coiled with a new, intense focus. "The Angels share bourbon," he stated, his voice flat. "A connoisseur's choice. A subtle, almost honeyed sweetness that makes it the perfect vehicle." "You are correct. An alkaloid toxin would be virtually undetectable within its profile." He was confirming her knowledge, testing its limits. "Silas has been with my organization for 8 months. He was vetted. He was trusted enough to be in that room tonight." He took a single, slow step towards her, not to intimidate, but to narrow the world down to just the two of them and the shared, bloody memory she had invoked. "But you, a bartender. You know the name of a man who died in a crossfire 2 decades ago. A man of no consequence to the wider world. A man whose death was a footnote, a piece of collateral damage in a war that was over before you were likely out of primary school." Before she could form a response, the door opened and a man who could only be Sal entered. He was older, with a face like a worn leather map and eyes that held a deep, weary intelligence. He carried a single, slim file folder. He did not look at Chloe, his entire attention fixed on his dawn. He handed the folder to Luca without a word. Luca took it, his eyes never leaving Chloe's face as he flipped it open. He scanned the first page, his expression unchanging. Then he turned to the second page. And it was there that his breath caught, a minute, almost imperceptible hitch that was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. His eyes lifted from the paper, and the look he gave her was utterly transformed. The storm in them had stilled, replaced by a dawning, impossible recognition that was so profound it seemed to physically alter him. He looked from the file in his hands to her face, then back again, as if verifying a miracle. "Robert Hayes," Luca said, his voice now stripped of all its calculated menace, leaving only a raw, bewildered husk. "Killed in an alleged gangland shooting on Mulberry Street. October 3rd. He paused, and when he spoke again, the words were measured, deliberate, each one heavy with the weight of a memory being dragged up from the depths. "The police report states he was struck by a single, stray round. It states he was there with his daughter." His gaze pinned her, not with threat, but with a desperate, burning need for confirmation. It states she was found unharmed, hiding behind a dumpster in the adjacent alley. A 7-year-old girl. Named Chloe. He let the file fall closed, the soft rustle of paper sounding like a thunderclap. The name, her name, hung in the space between them, a bridge across 20 years of violence and silence. The office, the bar, the present danger, all of it fell away. They were no longer a mafia boss and a bartender. They were the boy from the alley and the girl he had saved, standing in the same room, their shared past finally, irrevocably, catching up to them. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a shared, seismic history that had just violently collapsed the 20-year chasm between them. The air in the opulent office seemed to thicken, becoming a physical substance through which Luca Moretti's gaze traveled, a tangible force of stunned recollection. He was no longer looking at a variable in his security equation, or even at a woman. He was staring at a ghost, a living, breathing fragment of the single most defining, most human moment of his brutal life. The storm in his eyes had not abated, but it had changed, the cold fury of the present momentarily overwhelmed by the haunting, rain-soaked echoes of the past. He took a single, slow step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with a reverence that was entirely at odds with the men who had dragged her from the bar. His focus was absolute, his entire world narrowed to the woman standing before him. He stopped just short of arm's reach, his eyes performing a new, desperate inventory. He was no longer searching for tells of deception, he was searching for the little girl. He was looking for the shape of her eyes in the woman's steady gaze, the ghost of that childhood terror in the calm set of her jaw. "It was you," he breathed, the words barely a whisper, yet they seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the room. The gravelly authority was gone, replaced by a raw, disbelieving husk of a voice. All this time, his hand, the same one that had gripped her wrist with unyielding force, lifted slowly, almost hesitantly. He didn't touch her. His fingers hovered in the space between them, tracing an invisible line in the air, a memory given form. The rain, it was coming down in sheets. You were wearing a little blue coat. It was soaked through. His eyes glazed over, looking through her, into the past. You dropped a small, stuffed rabbit. It landed in a puddle. Chloe felt the breath freeze in her lungs. The detail was one her own mind had buried, too painful, too trivial amidst the gunfire and the blood. The rabbit. Its name had been Pip. A sob, long forgotten, tightened in her chest. She gave a single, sharp, involuntary nod, her own composure beginning to fracture under the weight of his remembrance. His hovering hand shifted, his gaze dropping from her face to her own hands, which were clenched at her sides. "Your hand," he said, his voice gaining a shred of its former strength, but it was now directed inward, at the precision of the memory. "You fell when I pulled you. You cut it on a piece of broken bottle in the alley. There was blood on your palm, mixing with the rainwater." His eyes lifted back to hers, seeking confirmation, seeking the final, irrefutable proof that this was real, that he was not dreaming this impossible moment into existence. Slowly, as if in a trance, Chloe unclenched her right hand and turned it palm up. There, a faint, silvery line, jagged and old, bisected the soft skin of her palm. A lifetime had passed, but the scar remained, a perfect, physical map to that single, catastrophic moment. The sight of it seemed to be the final, shattering blow to Luca's defenses. A shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of profound, almost painful release. The last vestiges of the wolf, the feared dawn, melted away, leaving in its place just a man confronting a living piece of his own tortured soul. He did not reach for her hand. He simply stood there, his own powerful frame seeming somehow smaller, the weight of his crown of violence momentarily too heavy to bear. The silence stretched, but it was no longer hostile. It was awed. It was humbled. It was the silence of two stars, flung from the same cataclysm, finding each other again in the infinite, dark expanse of time. The question of the poison, of Silas, of the immediate threat, all of it had receded into a distant, unimportant hum. The only thing that mattered now was the scar, the rabbit, the rain, and the impossible, undeniable truth standing in the quiet, lamplit room. The scar, that faint, silvery line on her palm, became the center of the universe. It was more than an old wound, it was a shared text, a single sentence written in blood and rain that both of them had spent a lifetime reading alone. Luca Moretti, the man who commanded fear with a glance, who held the life of the city in his impeccably tailored hands, seemed to unravel at the sight of it. The air left his lungs in a slow, controlled exhale that was not a sigh of resignation, but one of profound, earth-shattering recognition. The last fortress wall around his heart, the one built from necessity and hardened by 2 decades of ruthless survival, crumbled into dust, leaving behind only the raw, vulnerable boy who had once thrown himself into danger for a stranger. He did not move to touch the scar. To do so would have been too intimate, too sacrilegious, like touching a holy relic. His gaze remained locked upon it, as if he could see the very moment of its creation imprinted on her skin, the shard of glass, the shock that had momentarily overshadowed the greater terror, the small, bloody hand he had not had time to comfort. When his eyes finally lifted to meet hers, the storm had cleared. The gray was now the calm, clear hue of a dawn after a hurricane, filled with a bewildering, aching tenderness that made Chloe's breath catch. "All these years," he began, his voice raspy, stripped of all its power and leaving only a raw, human core. "I never knew your name. I only knew the face. I saw it in my dreams. I saw it every time I had to make a decision that pushed me further into the dark. That little girl in the blue coat, she was my line. The one good thing. The single, undeniable proof that I was not born a monster." He took a half-step closer, the space between them now charged not with danger, but with an almost unbearable poignancy. "And now you are here. You walked back into my life not as a victim, but as a savior. You stepped out of my past to save my future." The world outside the office, the bar, the waiting men, the traitor Silas, the entire city teetering on the edge of a gang war, felt like a distant, irrelevant dream. The only reality was this room, this moment, this impossible convergence of 2 destinies. Chloe found her voice, though it was soft, layered with the same awe that was etched on his face. "I never forgot you, either," she whispered. "I never knew who you were. But the memory of you, the boy in the alley, it was the only thing that made me feel safe after I lost everything. You were my ghost. And tonight, when I saw that poison, I couldn't let my ghost die." The word ghost seemed to hang between them, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Luca's lips. It was not a smile of amusement, but one of wonder, a crack in the granite that let a sliver of light shine through. "It seems we have been haunting each other," he murmured. The statement was simple, yet it bound them together with an intimacy deeper than any vow. They were 2 halves of a single, long-buried story, finally made whole. In that suspended silence, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The balance of power had dissolved, replaced by a fragile, powerful equilibrium. He was no longer her captor, and she was no longer his prisoner. They were equals, bound by a debt that could never be repaid, only honored. The path forward was shrouded in mist and fraught with peril, a minefield of his enemies and his own brutal world. But in that moment, as they stood gazing at each other, the ghost and the girl, the savior and the saved, the past and the present, none of that seemed to matter. They had found each other against all odds, and the story, their story, was only just beginning. And so, their dangerous, beautiful dance into the future begins. But their story is far from over. To follow Luca and Chloe as they navigate the treacherous waters of his world, to uncover the secrets still lurking in the shadows, and to witness a love forged in the fires of memory and destiny. Subscribe to ensure you never miss a chapter of this gripping tale. The next installment promises even greater tension, deeper passion, and revelations that will change everything. Join their journey now.